Hi and welcome. I'm Teddy Prout and I oversee Faith to Faithless, the apostate support programme for the national charity Humanists UK. Faith to Faithless was set up in 2015 to do two things: to raise awareness of the difficulties of people leaving high control religions in the UK, and to support those people, apostates, who have left high control religions and cults. Faith to Faithless raises awareness of apostasy by holding public lectures, public discussion events, presentations, engaging with social outreach organisations, support services and universities, as well as holding online conversations like this. Our team of volunteers support apostates by holding regular apostate socials, informal meetups, often held in cafes or over the weekend for a couple of hours. We also offer safeguarding training to frontline services to help them better understand the issues apostates face. And we hold facilitated peer support sessions for those in UK major cities who are struggling to leave high control religions and cults. To learn more about our work, visit our website, www.faithtofaithless.com. Today, I will be talking with Barry Boffy from the British Transport Police. Welcome, Barry. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So, to start with, Barry, could you tell us a little bit more about your role and the impact that being aware of diversity has on the British Transport Police?
Yeah, absolutely. My role is as Head of Inclusion and Diversity for the force. And for those who don't know what British Transport Police is, I suppose we should just clarify. We are the police service for the National Railway Network across England, Scotland and Wales. So quite a large remit. We also look after some of the metro systems in the UK, as well as the London Underground and London Overground systems. So the reality is, most people who will travel on the network or on the underground will have encountered a British Transport Police officer at some point without necessarily realising it. And that's one of the things, I suppose, that I wanted to kind of highlight to people, that we are a distinct police service from the Met Police, from West Midlands Police, from Greater Manchester Police. So we're not, I think someone described it once as you're kind of like the Rhodes Police version of your Home Office police force, but actually just looking at the railway network. We're actually a very distinct and separate police service. So that's just a little bit about the force. I hope you don't mind indulging me. The question on diversity, it's a really interesting and quite complicated one. And there are lots of reasons why diversity is important in policing. But most notably, it's that policing by consent model. In the UK, police services, all police services, it doesn't matter which service it is, including British Transport Police, we work towards a policing by consent model. And that means that we work with the consent of our communities. We're not militaristic, like some countries have militaristic kind of focus on the way that they police their citizens, but we don't. We very much want that consent of the public. And in order to achieve that consent, our police officers, our own police officers and our employees across the force should be representative of that community, of those communities. Which might seem quite an easy fix, but actually I think for anyone who's been keeping track of the news over the last 12 months in particular, it's not quite so easy to achieve. And some of that will be because of historical issues and tensions between communities, and that lack of trust and faith in policing that we are seeing in the Western world generally. So that's nothing specific to BTP. It is a policing kind of in a policing context right now. We will always aim to be as representative of our community as possible. And if I kind of step back a little bit and just break down what our community means, because again, as a police service that looks after a railway network, we don't have a fixed community. We don't police a resident population. There isn't anyone in the UK who is resident on the UK's railway networks. Everyone is transient. So we are encountering, and again, just headline stats for people who are interested, 6 million people travel on the railway network in the UK every single day. That's not a week, that's not a year, it's every single day, 6 million people up and down the country, England, Scotland, Wales, and through the underground. So we know of those 6 million, it's going to be a very diverse mix of the UK's community. But in addition to that, the community that is visiting the UK are tourists, people who are here for business, travelling for other reasons. So our communities are incredibly diverse, and they're as diverse as you could probably imagine they could be. We need to be representative of that. And it's not just so that we can mirror those communities in order to get their consent. There needs to be some kind of value behind that. You know, we could very easily ensure that, you know, 15% of our workforce is from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. But actually, what does that mean? How does that help us engage with communities and get that trust and confidence? And it would be the same for any group, as they would define themselves. So the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans community, for those with religion or without religion, it should be that balanced mix. And the way that I see diversity working for us as a police service, and this will be true of other services too, is that it's that diversity of thought that comes with those differences is absolutely incredibly valuable to us. We need to understand those communities, and it's not something necessarily that you can sit down with a textbook and go through and actually kind of go, well, what does this community believe? What are their core values? What's the history of that? You know, even as an equality, diversity and inclusion professional, I don't know, and I can never know everything about every type of diverse community or individual across the world. It's just not possible. But we know the people who do know, and they're the people who are part of those communities. They actually inform the way that we work. They inform our engagement with communities, and they can best advise us on how to get that confidence, how to work with people, and to provide them with services that are accessible and that are fair, that are transparent, and that actually that are fit for purpose, as we would expect policing to be in the 21st century. So it's a bit of a kind of winding question to that to that question. It seems quite simple, diversity. For me, there is also an extension that we've not mentioned, and that's inclusion. Diversity and inclusion are very, very distinct and separate. Again, going back to what I mentioned about, you know, having a diverse workforce is not enough. Actually, we need to be able to provide them with an inclusive workplace, and that they're in an inclusive working environment with inclusive practices. And that will allow people to be their genuine selves, actually bringing that their diversity of thought, their diversity of background, diversity of experiences and cultural backgrounds are all really valuable. But we know that people won't do that, or they won't feel comfortable in that environment if that environment is not inclusive. I've always described that kind of battle between diversity and inclusion as a leaky bucket. You know, it's the recruitment process for any organization is a bucket with holes in it, to some extent, that we can keep pouring in those kind of diverse individuals, getting the numbers to some extent. But without inclusion is the solder for those holes. It will actually retain those people. And with that retention comes the experience that we need. And there's lots of kind of, you know, outputs to that are really valuable to us, to policing generally, but to us as an organisation, in that we want that representation to flow across all of our ranks and all of our roles, and that we have that diversity, not just in frontline policing, so the PCs, the police constables and the PCSOs that you might see every day, that actually those people who are working in the intelligence bureau, those people who are actually, like me, working in a kind of supportive function, looking at things like our human resources services, our learning and development programs, it should be as diverse as possible. So a long-winded response to that question. I hope it clarifies, you know, to me, the value of diversity is valuable, but actually there's much more to it than that.
Absolutely. And thank you for that kind of very full answer. It raises for me several questions. You touched on policing by consent and the issue of trust. And of course, for a lot of people within apostate communities, people who have left high control religions, often their background has led them to be extremely distrustful of state organizations, including the police. the idea of social services, the idea of GPs, the idea of police forces in their various forms are all outsiders to be feared, to be distrusted, and not to be engaged with. And of course, for someone who is vulnerable, as a lot of apostates are, especially when they first leave their religion, that vulnerability puts them in very difficult situations where you would hope and want the police to be able to step in order to protect them, in order to provide the safeguarding that is required to make sure that they're safe. So there's that element to it, which I wonder if you might explore and touch on a little bit more around those sort of trust issues, specifically for apostates. But then the second thing that I really wanted to ask you some questions about as well is this idea of diversity, visibility, and inclusion, because like several of the groups that you mentioned within those communities and within those protected characteristics, you don't know just by looking at somebody that they are, that they have one of those protected characteristics. And that is very true of apostates. One's religion or belief is sometimes possible to discern from one's clothing or from things that people might wear as adornments. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are of that, that they hold that religious belief themselves. Some of them may be doing it for cultural reasons. And of course, without those visual clues, how do you know? And so I guess there's my sort of two questions. The first one is, what about trust, and how does the British Transport Police engender trust from apostates? And the second one is, how do you go about kind of making more visible and inclusive a service for people who aren't necessarily going to know what that visibility is going to be in practice?
I think, strangely enough, your question, both of those questions relate directly and indirectly to uniform. And that might not make any sense, but ultimately, we've always seen uniform as a barrier, because it's that homogeny. It's representing a homogeny, that actually all of these people look the same, they all present the same, and that uniform has a cachet to some extent. And we know there's a barrier there as a result of that. So that kind of trust issue, and the initial question that you were asking, is it's quite, to some extent, it's an easy question to respond to, and it's a difficult question to respond to. And a lot of the I suppose the easy way to respond to it, or the easiest answer to some extent, is about stripping away that kind of homogeneity to some extent, that kind of the visual representation of any organization as the organization first and foremost. If there was one thing that I could say to anyone who was fearful or distrustful of police officers who was potentially watching this video, is that actually police officers are individuals themselves. And very often when I'm engaging with communities for the first time, I will always try and kind of not represent myself in a way that I am before you've even heard from me. You understand that I work for a police service. And I always recommend that to our officers too. But one of the things that I will say to people is about the fact that, please remember that individuals don't go to work, put on a uniform, and then remove all of their other identities. They are bringing those identities with them, and that's what we find valuable. That, as I mentioned earlier, that diversity of thought, diversity of background, that's the value add that we are really looking for. We want individuals, and we want those backgrounds. And so, and again, when those individuals do their 12-hour shift and take that uniform off, they don't suddenly, my belief system has now changed into how it should be. It's not quite so so distinct as that. we obviously have a role, and our officers have a specific role around kind of, preventing crime, around, responding to people who are vulnerable and people who are in crisis more often than not. And it is that individuality, that personal touch, the stories, the kind of acknowledgement that actually I'm not just a uniform, and some of that comes with that initial interaction. I know that's quite difficult to do, but some of that will come with that initial interaction about actually getting to know someone and knowing that they're not reading from a script, they're not a robot, where this isn't just a kind of law enforcement response. These are individuals who all have their own backgrounds. Some of those you've mentioned are very visible, and obviously we can't hide those identities. So those from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, very visible. Our female officers are more often than not can't hide that identity too. But kind of veering into your second question about how do we represent that in a way that is visible, that actually you don't have to attempt the interaction with an officer first and then find out actually, oh, you understand me, you understand my background, is that we will always encourage our officers to display their identity in a way that is appropriate, obviously, but also, I suppose from a uniform perspective, we allow pin badges, for example. And I know a lot of our officers, there was one great interaction actually, which was a fantastic intervention by one of our officers who was wearing an LGBT rainbow pin, just representing the fact that they were part of the LGBT network. And it was that broke down the barriers between supporting someone who actually really was in a terrible crisis period themselves. And when we went back and engaged with that individual, who was in crisis, and much further after that period, it was that very prompt that allowed them to kind of, unload what was going on, why they were struggling, and what the crisis was, and felt that they could ask for that help. It's not always easy, we don't have. And I think, let's be honest, we all know this, we don't have badges for every identity. So, we don't, and I think this is not just as policing, I think we, as in the collective whole, that we wouldn't go out kind of wearing our identity on a kind of lanyard to say these are all the things that I tick, and this is who I represent. So we very much rely on our other tools for engagement, which are things like engagement at events directly. So to say that, I don't want to keep going back to the LGBT kind of network or that group specifically, but it's so obvious, when our gay officers, gay, lesbian and trans officers engage at Pride events, it's to represent themselves, but also it's to break down those barriers and say, look, to the rest of the community, we are you, you are us. There is no difference between us other than what we do for a living to some extent. That's a very simplified way of going about it. And we will do that for lots of engagement events across the country, for representing different communities, different events, different celebrations, as well as our social media tools. And our social media tools, sorry, were you going to ask a question? But our social media tools were very, very important to us to reach out to those communities who are resident population.
Yeah, absolutely. And social media has just such fantastic reach across the country to be able to do exactly that. I guess my question there really was about when you consider the apostate community. Of course, there isn't a community.
Of course.
In that sense, we one of the things that Faith to Faithless does is encourage people who have been through the process of leaving their religion to meet together, to socialize, and to form connections and fellowship with people who have been through similar experiences to themselves. But it's a bit of a leap to then go from that to saying, therefore, there is an entire community that is, kind of homogenous. That almost certainly isn't true. But there are pretty strong communities, particularly of ex-Muslim groups and ex-Jehovah's Witness groups, that do feel that sense of community. The question that we then have, of course, is one of identity and identification. How do you spot an apostate? How do you find out that someone is an apostate? What do you do in order to make sure that apostate is being protected? And I'm thinking here of at least a couple of different contexts in which this is most relevant. So the first is within communities where there is an apostate who is potentially being abused, but the community that they're in is very tight-knit, very insular, very closed. And as they're traveling around the network, it's obvious that something is wrong, but it's not obvious what that is. And, you know, sort of how do you then sort of start that engagement to identify that there is a genuine safeguarding problem that's happening on your watch, as it were.
Yeah.
And then the second one is, of course, people who find it very difficult to engage because their presentation comes with it so many other factors. And here I'm thinking of examples like asylum seekers, refugees who are, you know, fleeing tremendous persecution from whichever country you know, they are fleeing it from. And it is worth thinking in terms of the international picture that there are still dozens of countries where apostasy or blasphemy is not only a crime, but it's a crime where you are executed either by the state or by the mob for renouncing your religion. And so, of course, they come over to this country, and then there's all of that fear, there's all of that distrust, but also they don't necessarily, it's, as you say, it's not as though there's a badge that they can either wear themselves or look to on the uniform of a police officer to say, that's someone like me, I can go and talk to them. So I guess those are sort of my following questions. What's the identification? How do you spot it? How do you protect people? How do you have those sorts of conversations?
Yeah, I mean, without any additional training, it all comes down to the way that we engage with our members of the public. And that's really important that we get that right, how we present ourselves when we are operational, when officers are actually out and about at the station. And it doesn't take any specific or kind of specialized training to do that. It's about how we engage with customers, customer service to some extent. You know, are we approachable? Are we presenting as actually a barrier to it's someone asking for help and getting the help that they might need in that circumstance? So that's something that we very much instill in all of our officers about actually the value of customer service. I suppose just throw a bit of levity in here to some extent. For those of you who watched The Bill in the 1980s, there's that image of at the very beginning in the front credits of the program with the two sets of legs walking kind of very much in patrol. That's such an old-fashioned view of policing, and I think some people still feel that they're, you know, it's patrolling to some extent, and we are the peacekeepers, and peacekeepers in a kind of very, I don't want to use the term aggressive sense, but in a very standoffish sense, that actually we're here to catch the bad guys, and that's where our role stops. It's very much not that at all. And I think for us, I can't speak for any other police forces, but for British Transport Police, you know, we come across individuals in crisis all the time. In fact, on a daily basis. The railway network has its particular attractions, and that it does tend to attract individuals who are either fleeing from some kind of circumstance. So it might be a domestic violence circumstance, or actually just getting away from some controlling factors or some other unhappiness, and a place of refuge and safety and that kind of escape route. And we always recognize that is a tool for individuals to get away from those environments. So although I speak about, no specific training, we very much tailor our officers' training with that understanding in mind, that actually we are encountering individuals more often than not who are in crisis. That being said, we do specially train our officers to look for vulnerabilities anyway. And again, for that very reason, that we are working on the railway network, and that we are coming into contact regularly with those people who are in crisis. So, it is something that the intervention, we don't necessarily leave to them. So the individual who might be in that period might need the help of somebody. It doesn't necessarily need to be an officer, but somebody to kind of intervene. The intervention is for us to do. We are specially trained actually to see those vulnerabilities, and it's looking, I suppose, looking beyond the obvious. One of the things again that we have very much embedded into our training is that looking beyond the obvious perspective, because a couple of great examples would be, you know, all of our officers are very much kind of trained around the fact that if there is an individual who may be sleeping rough, you know, using the railway network, well, why are they using the railway network? Are they sleeping rough, or are they actually trying to escape from a situation that is bad for them ultimately, in whatever way? Similarly with young people, if someone's traveling without a ticket, is it because they're traveling without a ticket and they're trying to get away with it, or is it actually because they don't have access to their own money? You know, actually they've been in that controlling situation, and it's all those kind of different vulnerabilities. What we train our officers in is identifying the vulnerability, not necessarily the type of vulnerabilities, because I think the difficulty there is that that it's so prescribed, but so fluid that it's something that we don't want officers to overthink. So we don't want them to have to kind of go, well, what type of vulnerability is this person presenting with? That to some extent is an irrelevance. It is a vulnerability, full stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the vulnerabilities that you're talking about are ones that apostates would readily identify with. The idea of a lot of apostates who leave their religious community do so whilst they're still quite young. So teens, early 20s. In the case of some, they are literally thrown out of their home with no possessions, no money, no prospect. The entire security net of their community disappears almost overnight. And so there's that vulnerability that I think would resonate a lot with apostates. But the other one that you mentioned as well is domestic violence. And of course, in the case of a number of the high control religious groups, abuse, honor-based abuse, exorcisms, particularly physical exorcisms, those sorts of control methods are used in order to either suppress or to reform the apostate into, you know, kind of rejoining the community. So there's got a lot of vulnerabilities that go in with that. I guess the question that I wanted to sort of probe out a little bit was the statement that you made just before that point, which was about trying to make sure that there was a follow through of signposting, that the police officer themselves may not be the person who is dealing with that intervention, other than being the first person to speak to them or whatever that might be. And I guess the question that I then have is, what advice might you be giving to apostates when first approaching a British Transport Police officer, and what kind of reassurances might you give them that there are pathways and support mechanisms in place to protect and support them once that first conversation has been had?
Again, quite a loaded question there, and we could probably talk for quite some time on that particular issue. The reassurance I would give is ultimately that please remember that, you know, we are there to help in all instances, and that might seem quite a trite kind of throwaway response, but it's not meant to be. Again, it goes back to that perception of policing as peacekeepers versus, you know, what we do now in the 21st century. Policing is much more than kind of, you know, responding to crime. It is actually about supporting the most vulnerable in our society at a time where they are, and again, using that term again, you know, in crisis, whatever that might mean for them. So we do have a very good infrastructure of being able to kind of refer on to agencies, and that's either locally, again, going back to what I said at the very beginning when I explained, you know, as a police service, we cover the entirety of the UK. So we might be interacting with someone in Manchester Piccadilly station, and similarly we might be interacting with someone in Aberdeen, you know, in the far north of Scotland. All of our kind of officers will have made their own contacts, localized contacts with support agencies and networks, as well as those that we would work with who have a national remit anyway to support individuals. So that could be victim support if they are the victim of crime, you know, a fantastic network of support available. But we do think slightly more than just victim support. We do have other agencies across the UK, and I'm not going to name individual agencies because we could be here all day, that we actually have very good local arrangements with, who understand and work with, for example, refugees or asylum seekers directly. We know those people, we have those local arrangements, and as well as our own, I suppose, witness support units and individuals who are in those specific roles to support they're very specifically a victim of crime. But all of these involve, lots and lots of individual referral and support agencies and advocacy groups that we have access to. Similarly, we're in a very good position as a national police force because our network that we police actually dissects our Home Office colleagues networks. So the London Underground is in London. That's an obvious statement to make, but similarly, there are the East Coast Main Line, that runs through the entirety of almost the entirety of the UK, and that will cross through into a number of other Home Office police force areas that we actually have, again, localized arrangements with. We couldn't do our job without the partnership of the Met Police in London. Similarly, we couldn't do our job without the partnership of West Midlands Police in the West Midlands, and they in themselves have these fantastic and many different kind of advocacy group support networks that we can use to refer on to. So I hope that answers your question. The reassurance is that, I suppose for me, our officers will be the instigator of that interaction more often than not. It's something we train our officers to spot, and something they are very good at doing. And so we don't necessarily always have to wait for someone to come to us and say, I need help. We know that barrier is there. We will go to them and actually try and tease out from them what it is that's going on without judgment. Absolutely, being completely objective, and then finding a way that we can solve that issue for them if we can, or support them to get the help and support that they might need.
I mean, that's really valuable kind of reassurances and suggestions of what you've just been talking about. And one of the things that you've mentioned several times throughout our conversation that you've mentioned again then was, of course, that your officers are trained specifically to deal with vulnerability, to spot vulnerability, and then to actually do something that supports and safeguards individuals who find themselves in those situations. And I guess here I have an obvious set of questions. The first one, of course, is that Faith to Faithless runs a training program specifically for service providers like the British Transport Police, as well as social services, medical professionals, counsellors, local authorities and others, that trains them to be able to understand and spot what apostates go through, what kind of safeguarding concerns are then raised as a result of those, and where it may not necessarily be because they are subject to a specific crime, but because the circumstances that then surrounds that apostate makes them extremely susceptible to crimes then happening either to them or around them. And I guess the question that I had there is there anything within your training or within our training that you'd want to highlight to other service providers when thinking about apostates and the kind of work to kind of spot that vulnerability, that you would want to highlight and say, don't forget about these things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the one thing that I just wanted to pick up on, I suppose, on that, on your question around crime, and the association as police officers and police services only deal with crime. That's not the case. So again, we are kind of, our responsibility is to the vulnerable, and it doesn't matter if they've been subject to crime, or if they are, or if they are the perpetrators of crime themselves. Actually, it's the vulnerability, it's the safeguarding element that is our responsibility. It does come with the duty too. So just kind of wanted to make that very clear that actually it's not our role to deal with crime, and everything else is not our responsibility.
Of course.
So please, I hope that's okay. Secondly, I think for me, it would be, if there were any course, and that course that you represent, you know, I would recommend anyone who engages with members of the public, particularly in those kind of services like we provide, you know, engaging with people on a daily basis in a policing context or in a vulnerability or safeguarding context, I would say take advantage of that course that's available through, you know, Faith to Faithless. I think absolutely something that I would definitely recommend is invaluable. And again, it's that coming from a perspective that I wouldn't necessarily understand. You know, I haven't had that experience personally. It's not something necessarily that I think you can, going back to how I spoke about training, that you can give someone a handout and say, read this and you'll know what the issues are. So absolutely, I would recommend that. The key thing that I would say with any kind of content of delivery for me would be about remembering the context. One of the and I hope this makes sense, that and I'll try and explain myself what I mean by that, is that when we talk about apostasy and apostates generally, firstly, the majority of individuals don't understand that language. You know, it's something that it's an accurate description, but when we're engaging with your average member of the public, I would suggest that it's a word that is not familiar to them. So it's about, although we can use that terminology as we understand it, it's about actually being clear on what that means. Secondly, I would say that the context element would be for some, and those who maybe have not had or you know, don't have faith and have never had faith and have never been part of a religion, is that it might be difficult for them to understand the context in which we're kind of placing these individuals who are vulnerable. And who have specific needs and need specific support. And that goes back to, I suppose, explaining to them the fact that, you know, as humans, effectively, we are tribal to some extent, and we always want to belong. And we have our kind of tribes that we belong to, and most of those tribes will have some form of commonality between them. And that could be where we're born, it could be location, but it also could be religion and belief. And for some of those individuals, obviously, who are leaving religion or thinking about leaving religion, you know, that actually what they're leaving behind isn't just religion, it's an entire community, it's their whole worldview, it's their tribe that effectively they're walking away from to some extent. That's the kind of context, I think, which is really valuable to understand why there is such an impact, why these individuals really do need such good support, so that the individuals who are interacting with them understand it's not just someone who has kind of walked away from a subscription to some magazine where there actually is no impact there, and it's just something I've left behind and I'm going to move on with my life. There's a huge amount tied into religion, but tribe and who we belong to and where we belong, and for anyone kind of walking away from that, it can be deeply traumatic. We understand that. That's the kind of context that I think is incredibly valuable to anyone to understand apostasy and the experience of apostates.
And we would entirely agree with you. I think that absolutely hits the nail on the head there. This idea that one can leave their religion behind, leave the community behind, and all it means is, well, you just don't go to church on a Sunday. I mean, whilst that may be true for a significant number of people leaving particular religions, of course, the dividing line that we draw between people who leave their religion where there isn't an issue and where there is that level of control, the coercion, the abuse, and the safeguarding issues that then arise when somebody says, actually, I don't want to be a part of this tribe anymore. I don't want to be a part of this identity anymore. I don't believe in this, and I need to leave. And of course, it's not, apostasy is one of the reasons why people leave religious communities. There are, of course, others. The treatment that many LGBT people get within high control, very kind of ultra-Orthodox communities that take a very dim view of LGBT people is another reason why people then leave. And I completely agree that the idea of leaving those communities can be extremely traumatic, and create in individuals a kind of existential crisis, as well as very physical crises of homelessness, poverty, abuse, and other things as well. So I entirely agree with your points. I think I would only add that at Faith to Faithless, we have produced quite a wide range of resources that explore what it means to leave one's religion, especially within those very high control and coercive environments, both in terms of talks, but also in terms of the guides that we've produced and the resources that are on our websites. And of course, I encourage apostates and friends and family of apostates who are worried about them to read those resources and watch those videos. I just wanted perhaps end today's conversation on a slightly more general note, which is if a member of the public were to see something that they thought was not quite right, a bit suspicious, and perhaps they had some idea, either because they knew a little bit of the context or they just had noticed some of the signs that maybe something wasn't quite right, what would be your advice to those members of the public who are concerned about perhaps the safety of some of the people who are on the transport links up and down the UK?
This doesn't necessarily just apply to apostates. I think it's generally as a society. I've always really thought that individuals should be upstanders at all time. And with that kind of responsibility, it's that kind of responsibility to be kind to each other, to recognize, and again, they're quite basic tropes to some extent, and they feel quite throwaway, but it is our responsibility as a society, and define society however you feel, that we should look after our vulnerable people, that we should look after those who need our help, and that we shouldn't look the other way. And I would say that for lots and lots of different kind of vulnerable and diverse communities, not just those who apostates effectively, or anyone who is in an environment where they're trying to leave something that is coercive or controlling or damaging to them. It's actually just about being a good community member, and remembering that word community. We are still communities, and as fractious as politics may get, and as fractious as election fever may get, and as fractious as television and news may get, that actually, please remember, at the heart of the UK is community, and with that community comes kindness. I'm a firm believer that you should always stand up for those who need that help, and who can't stand up for themselves. So again, I hope that kind of gives you a sense of where I am, and I would always say, I always try to be an upstander, always, never a bystander. So it's about intervening in a way that is safe for you, that actually is doing the right thing for that person. And there are lots of ways of doing that, practical ways about actually engaging with someone, talking to them, striking up a conversation. Even, if you're struggling to find ways to do that, very obvious ways where, I love your shoes, where did you get them? I've used that one a number of times, where actually it's my go-to, whether they are good shoes or not. And I will use it to prompt that conversation, actually get that rapport going. And it's that human touch, that human interaction, I think, that is incredibly powerful in breaking that cycle of vulnerability.
Be kind, be decent, look out for others in need. I can't think of a better, more humane, more humanist way to end this conversation. And so I think it's probably time to bring us to a close. Barry, I want to just say a huge thank you for joining us and taking part in this conversation. I hope that you, our viewer, found this conversation interesting. To learn more about the work that we do to support apostates in the UK, please do find us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. Search Faith to Faithless, and do visit our website, www.faithtofaithless.com. If you'd like to make a small donation to enable us to continue creating and sharing content like this, then please click the donation link below. Thank you very much for watching.